So just on a practical level, what border militarization means, it means the border wall, it means more border patrol agents, it means surveillance equipment, and it means just concentrating enforcement in areas where people previously had been crossing. Just anecdotally, building a border wall costs an average of $12 million a mile. And then that is sort of juxtaposed against the fact that I think CBP itself, Customs and Border Protection, which is the parent network of Border Patrol, estimates that it costs the average person, or takes the average person 5 minutes to cross the border wall. They call it a speed bump. So that's $12 million a mile to create a speed bump for people who are coming across. Matt, did you have something?
I just was actually curious what the scale of that wall we're working is.
I guess in some places I think it's 12 feet, and in others it's 18. This looks like it's probably 12 feet tall.
It's another interesting thing to think about, that the border wall doesn't span the whole length of the US-Mexico border. There are portions where it's really high like this. There are portions where it's about this high. All of the types of border walls that exist are really easy to climb. I've done it. Like, it's easy to do no matter what you're looking at. Some of them are just vehicle barricades, like you're literally just walking right through it, and that's where most people are crossing, but other places it's not. Like, we have a slide we'll show later. It's pretty funny thinking about all the technology put into this. There's a simple ladder next to it that, pretty tech.
And then there's also areas like the area where Ricky and I work with the Mordettes, where there's no border wall south of it. So most of the people who are crossing in our area haven't crossed the border wall at all. I think there's a couple, and I guess one important thing to know about the way that the border wall has been constructed is that as part of the Real ID Act passed in 2005, there was a stipulation in there that authorized the Department of Homeland Security to waive any regulation that interfered with them constructing the wall. So I think that to date that includes something like 30 to 40 regulations that protect the environment and protect wildlife. And those have all just been waived so the wall can be built. And the wall, I guess the wall physically exists, and that impedes the flow of wildlife in between the US and Mexico, but also building the wall in lots of places means radically changing the landscape. It means building a road along the wall. It means bringing in trucks, it means bringing in equipment. So it's causing a amount of ecological disturbance.
One thing right there too, I mean the whole presentation we're giving starts with what you said, longer than 500 years, but very notably a time to think about. We are all living on stolen indigenous land, and when we're talking about this land, it's also stolen indigenous land. Specifically the O'odham people. Where we work is the Tohono O'odham, and the Real ID Act was really important there, really devastating, we should say there, a really critical moment, because it was the time that infrastructure was just being thrown up everywhere on these sacred, literally sacred sites that are being desecrated, right, by the US government. Border Patrol is just going in and basically shitting upon this really sacred land for indigenous people, in addition to harassing them and occupying even further.
And then there's that's what it looks like in practice. And so I guess, we're talking about the border wall a little bit. The border wall has been effective at keeping people from crossing in urban areas, as well as the strategy of prevention through deterrence. There's a lot of other effects, and you can call these side effects, but they also are, in many ways, the explicit, direct, intended effects of the new strategy. And so that includes feeding the human and drug smuggling industries, so raising the cost of buying diet travel through the desert, and feeding the drug smuggling industry. One really important effect of the strategy of prevention through deterrence is whereas people used to migrate seasonally, travel to the US to work, picking grapes in California, for example, and then migrate back to their homes in Mexico or in Central America, that is much less common now, because whereas before, in order to get into the United States, you might walk for a few hours, now people are walking for days and days and days, and literally risking their lives. So when people are coming to the United States to work, many times they're staying for years, rather than months as it was in the past. So it actually, in many ways, has encouraged people to stay in the United States who are here undocumented. Of course, that also results then in separating communities and separating families, because when people can't travel back and forth between their homes and the United States to work, they're spending more time in the United States, maybe separated from their families, or if they're deported from the US, where their families live, they're forced to be living in countries where they aren't with their families and risking more to get back. And then, I guess one of the things, Ricky and I come from the Mordettes, in part And No More Deaths was formed to address the fact that an enormous amount of suffering and death occurs among people traveling from Mexico to the United States. And that's a result of people being pushed out into mountainous areas, into deserts, and being forced to walk longer and longer distances. In our area, for example, people are walking from the border cities of Casa de Nogales up towards Tucson. Some people are walking all the way to Tucson. In other areas, people are walking all the way to Phoenix. People might be walking, even if a trip goes well, for up to 10 days. And this is, like, you're supposed to drink 4 gallons of water a day when you're in the desert hiking. If you're hiking for 10 days, like, it's impossible to carry enough water, it's impossible to carry enough food, it's impossible to carry enough blankets. And so people are getting lost, they're getting, Border Patrol attempts to apprehend people, and people are separated from their guides. There's like innumerable ways that people can end up either suffering in the desert or eventually dying in the desert attempting to get to Tucson or the other border cities.
Sorry. So is that 10 days is obviously excluding the travel it takes them to get to the border, correct? That's just after they've crossed?
Yeah.
Right on, okay.
But much of it is even getting to the actual line that delineates these arbitrary lines of the countries right now. So whereas people used to get right up to the border, you're walking at least a day, if not days, in Mexico now. It's just getting longer and longer and more remote of areas.
And what time frame is that? Because is it a year, or it says 11,000?
This is actually 7 years.
Over 7 years? Okay.
Yeah, this is 2007, just in Arizona, and it says it's 1,138 deaths. And one really important thing to keep in mind is that these are recovered human remains. These aren't the number of people that died, considering the fact that these are enormously vast areas. People walking in mountains and canyons. There are academic estimates say 2 to 3 times as many deaths. There's a lawyer that works with No More Deaths that estimates 10 times as many deaths. So this is a tiny, tiny fraction of the number of people who are dying crossing the border, not to even mention the number of people who come close to death and are taken to hospitals, not to mention people who go hungry or cold or thirsty on their travels north.
Yeah. And so just to give some different figures, I can't remember the exact date, but I think roughly 94 to where we are right now in 2011, there's over 6,000 recovered remains. And again, that's the recovered remains. So I don't like to argue numbers, but if you want to think about it, do your estimates right, what those different guesses could mean, how many people actually are dying or have died.
This past year in Arizona, there were 253 recovered human remains, and that's the second most of any year. I think dating back to 2005 or 6, there was a year where there were higher, but 253 people died in Arizona and their bodies were recovered this past fiscal year.
Meaning in the most deadly months being July, there were 60 remains recovered. That's recovered 2 a day.
And then of course it's not just about people dying, right? Like there's a small fraction of people that die, and since 1994 the percentage of people that die has increased greatly, but like there are very, very few people who attempt to cross who don't suffer, and some of those people suffer immensely. This is just one way, like in the desert, blisters can be a death sentence if you end up with blisters and fall behind your guide, or in this case you end up just with horrific pain. And so the number of different ways that people suffer crossing the border is much broader than just that. So I guess one thing that we mentioned earlier is that border enforcement has expanded the scope of the cartels in Mexico. And so essentially, since 1994, the cartels have extended their influence to not just include drug smuggling, but also human smuggling, and are consolidating their presence at the border and their control of guides who guide people across the desert. And as you can see, the areas where different cartels have influence has sort of shifted over the years, and those shifts often are accompanied by a lot of violence, like people struggling for different terrain, the different cartels fighting over who has control of different areas to take people and drugs across. And we see even out in the desert, the proportion of people carrying drugs to people traveling, or the number of people traveling, shifts as control in different areas among the cartel shifts.